folks? Welcome back to Logical, Plausible, Probable. This video is going to be a bit more of a just kind of raw download because I've been getting a lot of pushback from people because I haven't gone into extraordinarily insane detail with some of the different arguments I made in my first couple videos. Part of that's because I'm actually working on some very detailed and expansive expositions on some of the different arguments that I'm making. But I've been getting so many comments and people coming after me that I decided to kind of address some of the more common objections and to be quite honest, stunning ignorances of a lot of the folks who have been attacking me, especially in the context of evolution, abiogenesis, whether or not DNA, genetic code, is a programming language, and a variety of other facets. That it's actually very interesting because a lot of these topics are high-level talking points in the atheist world as well as evolutionary biology, and so often they completely gloss over what is actually being discovered and research that I've done that and papers that I've read that make it extraordinarily difficult to conclude that a lot of these positions that are being put forth are remotely plausible conclusions to reach regarding our very existence, and also both from a abiogenesis perspective as well as getting into just evolution in general. So one of the primary things that I've been getting a lot of attacks on is about genetic code being equivalent to a programming language. So it seems that a lot of people don't actually know what the heck they're talking about in the context of what actually constitutes a representative relational programming language. And because I often make the comparison to HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, and then the translation process into binary code. So let's break down and look a little bit real quick at how programming languages that we use on a day-to-day basis actually work. So let's use binary, for example, and a quick example of that is the letter A in binary is translated to equal 01001, right? Well, you have to think about this. What actually makes A equal to 01001 in binary? Well, it was assigned. It was an assigned arbitrary value that said, hey, we're going to have these zeros and ones combination equal to this letter. And then it obviously extrapolates out for the entire alphabet, and then from there you're able to create logic rules and the syntax, the semantics, the pragmatics of how the code language, the programming language, is actually going to execute different functions, as well as how normal humans, because writing in binary, I mean, good grief, that'd be extraordinarily that's way too hard for the average person, and it would just take too long. It wouldn't be a practical application. So we had to come up with normal languages to be able to use to actually create the code and then translate that into binary for the computers to actually execute. Well, in the comparison to genetic code, we've got codons. Actually, let me rewind here. So the genetic code is made by sequences of the 4 base pairs, A, C, G, and T, and the sequence and the order in which they bind in our DNA is actually, it makes our DNA genetic code a quaternary variable versus a binary, like zeros and ones. We got 4 options. But beyond that, those options are then condensed into codons. So codons are 3 of the base pair sequences in a set, and that's how it's read and ultimately executed. But let's talk about that. So you've got AUG that equals amino acid XYZ. And, people so often buy into the standard talking point that is issued ad nauseum about how everything that's happening in biology, it's just deterministic chemistry and it's just baseline chemical reactions. Okay. Are there chemical reactions? Yes. Is there information that is being transmitted and utilized in the chemical reaction as the medium by which to execute what is contained therein inside of the sequences? Yes. And that's the very, very primary factor that people just forget about is multiple things. Number one, the sequence of DNA does not turn into, those chemicals, those base pair chemicals in the nucleotides do not turn into an amino acid in the ribosome as a protein is being formed. They are equal to it. Just like A is equal to 0, 1, 0, 0, 1 in binary, this codon sequence of base pairs in the DNA, in the genetic code, are equal to amino acid XYZ. That is I know I just said this, but it is an easily forgotten factor of they are not the same thing. It's information that is read during the process of the creation inside the ribosome. It does not turn into it. So let's think about this. What is actually happening in the execution of these sequences? So a specific gene that is needed, and there's a zillion different steps that are happening prior to this, but this gene has been selected. Then a different type of protein comes in, activates that. Once the gene has been activated, begins the transcription process. Now, here's where it gets very fascinating to me from information perspective. So the DNA gene sequence is then translated at this point into RNA, and there's a substitution to a different base pair for one of the letters, but then it's transcribed, literally, physically transcribed into an RNA, an mRNA molecule sequence. This is all happening inside the nucleotide of your cell, by the way. Or sorry, the nucleus of your cell, by the way. And then from there, different proteins come and physically grab it, physically transport it outside to where a ribosome comes and latches on and then begins to physically read the sequence of information of these codons, these triplets of base pairs that are containing information for the different sequences, or for the different amino acids that are needed for this specific protein, and reads it literally like a data strip, okay? As this is happening, now how is the protein actually coming in? Well, as there's another thing called a tRNA, which is a transfer RNA, and this molecule has base pairs at one end that are going to be searching for pairing with the specific codon that is part of that mRNA sequence. At the other end of it, it has the ability to grab specific amino acids that are equal to whatever that particular codon is representing. But here's where it gets very, 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 very interesting. So not only is it arbitrary, right? There's actually not enough tRNAs to account, in the vast majority of cells, to account for all the different possible amino acids that could be gotten, or that could be potentially executed. However, when it comes in, if it has the wrong one, even if the base pair at the other end of that tRNA as it comes into the ribosome to grab, hey, we're the right spot, and then insert that amino acid into the elongation sequence, if it happened to have grabbed the wrong one, somehow the ribosome, this little factory that's actually making the proteins, the ribosome knows that it has the wrong one, even though, in theory, it has the appropriate matching base chemicals in that tRNA. Now, if it has the wrong one, what happens? It literally stops the process, basically kicks it out, and then has the appropriate one brought in. So let's think about this and what we're talking about here. So from a processing perspective. So we've got an information sequence in our DNA genetic code. A robot comes in, transcribes that information into a mRNA, which then leaves the nucleus and is physically transported outside where a factory protein, which is very complex, by the way, it's 82 different parts, comes in, clamps on to this string of data, begins to read it. tRNAs come in and start matching up the appropriate information, but if there's errors, it fixes it. I mean, this stuff to me is just, and not only is it just mind-bending from a, how cool is this from just a nanotech perspective, but this leads you to the point where, by the way, I'm not even covering a minuscule fraction of what's actually going on in this process, but you have data over here that is information contained in base pair sequences that are not chemically equal to what is actually being executed, but is being read and processed to equal that. Now, in a computer, you've got a translation component and your compiler and whatnot that takes the HTML, the CSS, the C#, the C++, whatever the language is, and takes all those commands and those logic rules, the syntax, and the different functional components to it, turns it into binary, then the computer can execute the program. In the human body, actually every form of life, you have code being translated and then executed to create something. And but beyond all of this, where it gets even more fascinating, is it turns out, and they discovered this back in 2014, that there's actually there's a whole bunch of additional components to this that I'm leaving out in terms of the actual execution of the transcription process initially. But in context of the actual creation of a protein, they found out multiple things. Number one, that not only does our DNA genetic code contain the sequences of the amino acids information, the organization of specific letters in those sequences directly correlate with a secondary set of logic rules and programming code base for what's called translational pausing. So it turns out that in order to actually have a protein form correctly, it's not just as simple as, hey, this amino acid, putting them all in this linear line, and then magically it turns into the end protein. It turns out there's actually timing components, temporal controls that are required for the protein to form correctly. Because as that chemical reaction process starts, when you start binding the protein or the amino acids together, it begins to fold on its folding starts taking place. But if you don't pause in certain points and you do it too quickly or too slowly, then it folds beyond what it needs to be, and you don't actually end up with the correct structure of the piece of nanotech that's being created. And that's where it gets even more ironic. It seems, and has been shown, that our ribosomes, if that happens and it gets jacked up, it literally terminates the process. So if this is just purely deterministic chemistry, and the appropriate amino acid has come in, but it hasn't come in the right time, how in the heck does this nanorobot factory machine, the ribosome, know that it wasn't done in the right time? Now, as a human, if we're observing a chemical reaction, then if we see something's going wrong, we have the ability to stop that transaction or that process, or start over, or modify things, right? Because we're able to observe and we know what the intended outcome is of that process. But if you're going to argue that our very existence is dependent upon deterministic chemical properties and functions and reactions, how is the time variable, and what is the appropriate outcome from a physical shape perspective? How is that known by something that we argue does not have intelligence? So you have to really consider what is actually being presented here. And then beyond that, you have to think about it from the perspective, going back to code, of, all right, so our genetic code has the appropriate sequences of the amino acids, and it has the ability inside of the same sequence base to direct the timing execution of these chemical reactions, and then ask yourself, is it actually a logical and reasonable conclusion that this information could possibly come into existence without an intelligent agent being required? Because if you say that that is the case, and that is a totally reasonable conclusion to reach, then when you take a look in the context of computer programs, you're having to argue that, say, HTML created itself as comparison to DNA, for example, and then somehow the execution, the translation process, that is the formation of the mRNA, was somehow came into existence, and then the actual execution and the processing of the information that has been translated is somehow reasonably a natural thing that's just gonna happen. And hey, enough time's gone by that computers created themselves, programming languages created themselves, and not only did they create themselves, they also somehow managed to write programs in without a human. No programmers were required in order to create, comprehensive, extraordinarily complex systems that all work together and also have the ability to self-replicate. And that brings me to another argument that I hear so often, which is I crack up when I read this, and people talk about, oh, well, this, you can't compare this to a software program because, organisms self-replicate, and you can't account for that. When I think about this, I'm like, okay, so let's think about your actual argument here. You are suggesting that it is more reasonable to conclude that a arbitrary programming language with multiple subset code bases came into existence by chance and is required for all forms of life to exist. Number one, just the data and the information that it contains and the logic rules and the if, then, and else functions, just like any other programming language. This had to happen totally by chance, number one. Number two, somehow the additional elements that are required for the replication process also popped into existence 100% by chance. So let's think about this. In comparison to, say, a website, right? Or any mobile app. Could I write a script, if I wanted to, that said, hey, every 24 hours, I want you to copy yourself? Yeah, you could. Absolutely. No ifs, ands, buts about it. You could also say, hey, I've got 2 copies of this same app, but we've had additional data variables that have been inserted into it over the course of that day. I want you to merge both databases. And then to say that somehow the core programming logic rules and the code base and all the different functions that have been created for that particular application, through minor modifications and errors in the copying, that conjoining of the database and the code merging every time, right? And for people who claim that there's no errors in software application are idiots and have no freaking clue about how this stuff actually works. And you should go do some Google and check out how information is lost and noise and copying, editing, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, you're coming to the conclusion that somehow this very basic app, if you gave it billions of years of just every day it merges and creates a copy of itself, and each copy has slight modifications that happen on a daily basis, that somehow that app is going to just metamorphosize over into some exponentially more complicated with all sorts of brand new functions. It started off, hey, you can take a picture and do a caption on it, and then a billion years from now, somehow all of that turned into all of the functions that are available on YouTube. I mean, in any other context, if I made that argument to you, you would look at me like I was a complete idiot who had no idea about what was a remotely reasonable, logical, plausible, and probable conclusion about what could happen with technology advancement. And yet, because somehow organisms have the ability to replicate data and copy itself, which just that is mind-blowingly complex. And if you don't believe me, I suggest you go and Google that and go on YouTube and watch videos of how it actually happens. Your mind will be blown when you actually look at the real physical execution of what is going on in this process and all of the nanotech protein robots that are required in order for this to happen. And you have to ask yourself, where did the data come from? If the genetic code is a programming language that is an arbitrary utilization of separate sequences, chemical sequences, that can be translated into XYZ, how is it a remotely sane conclusion that that could have happened purely by chance?